When my son got married, I kept quiet that I had inherited my late wife's ranch. Good thing I stayed silent because a week later my daughter-in-law showed up with a notary. But her arrogant smile disappeared completely when I made my move. My name is Dominic Wright. I am 70 years old, an African-American man who spent his entire life building foundations out of concrete and steel. I thought I built a solid foundation for my son Jordan, but I was entirely wrong. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth and treated your sacrifices like dirt. The heavy bass from the wedding band vibrated relentlessly through the polished floorboards of the grand ballroom. I sat entirely alone at table 42. My seat was pushed tightly against the swinging kitchen doors. The catering staff constantly bumped my chair with their hips as they rushed out, carrying silver trays of roasted quail and crystal flutes of imported champagne. I did not complain about the location. I sipped my ice water and watched the extravagant celebration from the shadows of the room. Heather, my new daughter-in-law, marched across the pristine white dance floor with purposeful aggression. She wore a custom silk gown that cost significantly more than the first car I ever purchased. She stopped abruptly at my table and glared down at me. She did not extend a warm greeting or thank me for attending her special day. She did not ask if the waiters had brought me a plate. She pointed a sharply manicured finger directly at my chest. She told me my faded charcoal suit was a complete visual disaster. She stated the worn fabric severely clashed with her meticulously curated aesthetic and was ruining the background of the professional photographs she had paid thousands of dollars to commission. She demanded I immediately relocate to a dark corner booth near the coat check until the photographer finished capturing her flawless evening. I looked up at the young white woman who had just married my only child. Her eyes held absolutely no warmth, only a cold, calculating determination, protecting an image she desperately needed to project to her wealthy friends. She crossed her arms, tapping her satin heel against the floorboards, waiting for my absolute compliance. The disrespect hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I placed my hands flat on the cheap linen tablecloth covering table 42. I stared down at the deep, permanent calluses and thick scars mapping my dark palms. I earned every single one of those scars pouring concrete in the blistering summer heat and freezing winter rain for 30 straight years. I worked grueling double shifts on high-rise construction sites across the city to ensure Jordan never had to sign his name on a crippling student loan document. I paid his Ivy League university tuition in full, with the sweat of my brow, the ache in my spine, and the relentless sacrifice of my own youth. I expected absolutely no gratitude for doing my duty as a father, but I demanded basic human respect. Jordan approached the table a moment later, noticing the tension. He wore a tailored custom tuxedo that fit him perfectly, a stark contrast to my worn charcoal jacket. He saw his new wife glaring at me like a pest. I waited patiently for my son to defend his father against her blatant insult. Instead, Jordan placed a gentle, supportive hand on Heather's waist and turned a deeply disappointed gaze directly onto me. He firmly told me to stop causing an unnecessary scene. He lowered his voice to a harsh, cutting whisper and instructed me to accommodate Heather's wishes immediately, because this night was solely about building their high society brand, not about my comfort. I looked at the boy I had raised from a child into a man. The brutal realization hit me with the physical force of a falling steel beam. Jordan did not view me as a parent to be honored or loved. He viewed me as a blue-collar embarrassment. I was a shameful stain on the glossy, sophisticated life he was desperately trying to manufacture, with a woman who measured human worth entirely by the price tag attached to a suit. He chose her illusion over my blood. I did not raise my voice in anger. I did not throw my glass of ice water against the wall or loudly demand an apology in front of their affluent, staring guests. Silence is often the heaviest and most effective weapon a man can wield against sheer arrogance. I slowly pushed my chair back, the wood scraping against the floorboards, and stood up to my full height. I reached into the breast pocket of my faded charcoal jacket and pulled out my worn leather wallet. I extracted a crisp, folded $100 bill and placed it squarely on the center of the table. I told Jordan the money was to adequately cover the cost of the expensive meal they had not even bothered to serve me. I buttoned my jacket, turned my back on the lavish party, and walked steadily toward the main exit. I did not look back when Jordan finally called out my name in a panicked tone. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the freezing night air. The bitter cold bit sharply into my lungs, but the sudden drop in temperature felt immensely cleansing. The oppressive fake noise of the ballroom faded away instantly. I walked down the empty city street with my head held high. I was reclaiming my dignity with every silent step I took away from a son who had completely lost his moral compass and surrendered his soul to an empty facade. The walk home gave me time to process the magnitude of the betrayal. I had spent decades building a solid structure for my family, but the foundation was rotten. Jordan had traded integrity for status. He sold his heritage for a seat at a table that did not value him. I reached my building feeling a profound sense of closure. The son I knew was gone. The next morning, I sat alone at the small wooden table in my cramped city apartment. The old radiator hummed softly in the background, offering the only warmth in the room. I opened my laptop to pay my monthly electric bill, seeking the familiar comfort of my quiet, independent routine. I logged into my secure bank portal with my credentials. I navigated directly to the savings account tab. My emergency fund had held exactly $12,000, the result of careful budgeting and frugal living over the past 5 years. The screen loaded slowly, eventually displaying a glaring red balance of absolute zero. I blinked heavily, leaning closer to the harsh light of the monitor to ensure my aging eyes were not deceiving me. The detailed transaction history revealed a massive, unauthorized wire transfer executed at precisely midnight, right as the wedding reception reached its drunken peak. The money had not simply vanished into a digital error. It had been funneled directly into a newly established joint account registered under the names of Jordan and Heather Wright. They had not just publicly humiliated me at the wedding. They had systematically robbed me. The blatant disrespect at table 42 was merely a calculated distraction. The real assault happened in the dark, while I was walking home in the freezing cold. My own son had stripped my final safety net to fund his fabricated life of luxury. I closed the laptop deliberately. The silence in my apartment no longer felt peaceful or safe. It felt exactly like the ominous calm before a devastating storm. The silent adjustment had officially begun. I realized then that my son was not just misguided. He was actively dangerous. He believed my resources existed solely to fuel his ambition. He severely underestimated the man who provided those resources. I locked the deadbolt on my front door and prepared for war. I was drinking my black coffee when a heavy fist hammered against my apartment door. 1 week had passed since the wedding. I unbolted the lock to find Jordan and Heather occupying my narrow hallway. They were not alone. A short, nervous man in a cheap beige suit stood behind them, clutching a worn leather briefcase. Heather pushed past me without an invitation. She marched directly to my small kitchen table and dropped a thick stack of legal documents onto the scarred wood. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. Jordan closed the door and introduced the stranger as a licensed notary public. Heather did not offer pleasantries. She aggressively stated that my appearance at their wedding reception deeply concerned her. She claimed I looked physically frail and mentally disoriented. She declared they needed me to sign a comprehensive set of medical directives immediately. She insisted these documents were merely a standard precaution to ensure I received proper care if my cognitive state declined further. The notary clicked his pen, eager to finish the transaction and leave. Jordan stood by the window with his arms crossed, avoiding my direct gaze. He stared out at the city traffic below, letting his wife orchestrate the ambush in my own home. Heather tapped her sharp fingernail against the top page, pointing exactly where I needed to sign. She spoke to me with the slow, exaggerated articulation one might use for a confused child. I did not react to her insulting tone. I kept my face entirely impassive. I stepped closer to the table and looked down at the dense paragraphs of legal jargon she had presented as a simple health precaution. I ignored their rushing voices and deliberately pulled out my chair. I sat down and began sifting through the thick stack of papers. Heather sighed loudly, expressing her severe impatience. I flipped past the standard medical proxy forms at the front. Hidden beneath them was a blanket asset transfer agreement. The legal language granted Jordan complete control over my financial estate. I glanced up and noticed a folded piece of heavy blue paper clutched tightly in Heather's left hand. I recognized the official county seal immediately. It was a misrouted property tax document for the 500 acres of prime Montana ranch land I owned. My late wife Valerie inherited that sprawling property from her father. The Montana ranch was not just dirt and grass. It was a sanctuary bordered by pristine rivers and timber forests. It represented generations of hard-fought ownership. During her final months battling illness, Valerie watched Jordan grow increasingly arrogant and obsessed with unearned wealth. She saw the greed taking root in his heart. Valerie knew Jordan would view the land merely as capital to be liquidated. She explicitly warned me that his ambition would eventually blind his morality. Valerie transferred the master deed solely into my name 2 weeks before she passed away. She made me swear to protect the land from our son until he proved he possessed the character required to manage it. Jordan had clearly failed that test. Heather, shifting her grip on the blue paper, told me everything I needed to know. They had discovered the existence of the ranch. The medical directive was a thinly veiled smokescreen designed to legally strip me of Valerie's legacy. They intended to use my signature to seize the 500 acres. Staring at the asset transfer agreement, I realized my wife's warning had officially materialized into a direct threat. I felt a cold surge of adrenaline pump through my veins. The sheer audacity of their plan required a ruthless response. They were actively attempting to declare me incompetent to steal the only thing my wife left behind. I kept my breathing steady. I knew any display of anger would only validate Heather's fabricated narrative regarding my emotional instability. I had to outmaneuver them perfectly. I maintained a mask of absolute harmless ignorance. I tapped my chest pockets repeatedly, feigning sudden confusion. I looked up at the notary and offered a helpless, apologetic smile. I informed the room that I had mistakenly left my prescription reading glasses at the local optometrist's office the previous afternoon. I stated clearly that I could not decipher a single word on the pages before me. Heather's face flushed with instant rage. She snatched the pen from the table and tried to force it into my calloused hand. She insisted she would read the documents aloud and summarize the contents. I firmly shook my head. I looked directly at the notary public. I reminded the nervous man that it is a severe violation of the law to witness the signature of a senior citizen who explicitly states they cannot read the binding legal contract. The notary took a step back, his professional liability overriding Heather's aggressive demands. He shook his head and quickly packed his stamp back into his leather briefcase. He informed Jordan that he could not legally proceed under these conditions and would have to return when I possessed my corrective lenses. Heather opened her mouth to argue, but the notary was already moving toward the front door. He refused to risk his state license for their rushed transaction. Jordan shot me a look of intense frustration. He aggressively checked his gold wristwatch, clearly operating on a highly compressed timeline. He grabbed his coat from the back of the chair, realizing the ambush had completely failed. I watched my son march out of the kitchen without uttering a single word of farewell. I remained seated at the table, offering a polite nod. I promised Jordan I would retrieve my glasses by tomorrow morning so we could handle the paperwork properly. I had successfully bought myself exactly 24 hours to dismantle their conspiracy. Jordan escorted the flustered notary down the hallway to ensure he caught the elevator. Heather did not follow them immediately. She stepped just outside my front door, leaving it cracked open by a fraction of an inch. She pulled her smartphone from her designer purse. I stood up silently from the kitchen table and crept toward the entryway. I pressed my back flat against the cold plaster wall, holding my breath to listen. Heather spoke in a hushed, frantic tone. She was not calling a friend to complain about her stubborn father-in-law. She was speaking to someone she addressed as a corporate developer. I listened as she aggressively assured the man on the other end of the line that the minor delay meant nothing. She explicitly promised him that the master deed to the Montana property would be completely secured and ready for transfer by Friday morning. She told the developer to prepare the initial wire deposit because the land was practically in their hands. A terrifying realization settled over me. This was not a vague plan for their distant future. They had already negotiated a massive commercial sale of Valerie's pristine acreage. They had buyers lined up and waiting for the ink to dry on my forged surrender. Heather ended the call and sharply pulled the door shut behind her. The metallic click of the latch echoed through my empty apartment. The 24 hours I had just secured were no longer a buffer. They were a countdown. My son was prepared to erase our family legacy by the end of the week. I walked over to the closet and pulled down my heavy winter coat. The steady vibration of the city bus engine did nothing to calm the cold fury locking my jaw. I gripped my leather satchel tightly as the vehicle ground to a halt in the center of the financial district. Towering glass skyscrapers blocked out the morning sun, casting long, dark shadows across the concrete sidewalks. I stepped off the bus and walked directly into the polished granite lobby of the city's premier legal high-rise. I bypassed the receptionist, took the elevator straight to the 20th floor, and marched into the corner office of Bradley, my late wife Valerie's longtime corporate attorney. Bradley looked up from his work, his sharp eyes widening in surprise as I slammed the thick stack of medical directive forms directly onto his mahogany desk. The sharp slap of paper against wood cut through the quiet room. I sat in the leather chair across from him, leaning forward until our eyes locked. I did not ask him how he was doing. I did not waste a single second on polite greetings. I pointed a calloused finger at the fraudulent documents and demanded he immediately initiate a comprehensive emergency forensic audit of my son Jordan's personal and corporate finances. I told Bradley that Jordan and Heather had crossed a line from regular greed into calculated criminal behavior, and I needed the exact numbers to see how deep the rot truly went. Bradley pulled the documents toward himself, his expression hardening as his eyes scanned the asset transfer clauses hidden beneath the medical jargon. He reached for his keyboard, logged into the secure state financial registry, and began executing a deep pull on Jordan's registered corporate entities. The soft clicking of Bradley's mechanical keyboard filled the silence as columns of numbers and hidden bank records materialized across the dual monitors. Bradley leaned back in his chair, his dark skin turning a pale gray under the harsh fluorescent lights of the office. He looked at me with an expression of pure dread and revealed the unvarnished truth. Jordan did not build a highly successful technology startup, as he had loudly bragged to the family for the past 3 years. He had constructed a massive financial house of cards, leveraging every single piece of credit available to his name. Jordan and Heather were completely drowning under a combined debt of $3 million owed entirely to a notoriously predatory private equity firm that specialized in aggressive asset liquidation. The $12,000 emergency fund they had covertly stolen from my savings account at midnight was not being used to finance a new business venture. They used it merely to satisfy the monthly interest penalty to keep the firm from initiating immediate foreclosure on their high-end downtown condo. Bradley pointed at a flagged real estate transaction on his screen. They had already entered deep negotiations with a commercial resort developer. They intended to forcefully seize Valerie's 500-acre Montana ranch, liquidate the timber rights, and sell the land to erase their entire $3 million debt in a single transaction. Valerie had known this day would come. She spent her final months watching Jordan alienate himself from our community, choosing the hollow lifestyle of high society over the honest work that built our family. She left the land to me because she knew I possessed the backbone to protect it. A profound, freezing stillness settled over my chest as the last remaining thread of paternal obligation snapped cleanly in half. I felt no sorrow, only the cold, sharp clarity of a construction manager facing a structural collapse. I looked at Bradley and explicitly instructed him to prepare an airtight, scorched earth legal defense. I told him we would not call Jordan to demand an explanation. We would not send a warning letter or engage in a loud emotional confrontation that would allow them to claim I was acting out of irrational vengeance. We would remain completely silent and build an inescapable legal trap that would catch them in the absolute act of their own deception. Bradley nodded in absolute agreement, his fingers already flying across the keys to draft an emergency injunction to restrict all transfers on the Montana ranch deed. We needed to freeze their access before they could present any signed surrenders to the commercial developers. I stood up from the leather chair, pulling my coat tightly around my shoulders, preparing to execute the next phase of the defense. I was ready to use every single boundary Valerie and I had established over 40 years of marriage to protect what was rightfully ours. We had earned that land through decades of manual labor, and I would see Jordan face the full weight of the law before I allowed his greed to pave over his mother's memory. A sharp, high-pitched chime suddenly pings from Bradley's desktop computer, shattering the brief moment of resolution. An automated red alert box flashed repeatedly on the center of the primary monitor, originating directly from the county clerk's digital filing portal. Bradley froze his eyes, scanning the data feed as he pulled the registry up. A formal durable power of attorney document had just been officially filed and approved in the state registry under my legal name. Heather had completely bypassed the mandatory 24-hour waiting period we had triggered at the apartment. She had utilized a forged copy of my signature, a fraudulent witness list, and a heavily bribed notary public to push the filing through the system at dawn. The county clerk's database showed the document was fully active. Jordan now possessed the legal authority to sign contracts on my behalf. Bradley looked up at me, his voice tight with immediate urgency. He informed me that Jordan and Heather were not waiting until Friday to secure the developers' signatures. Armed with the fraudulent power of attorney, they were actively moving to finalize the sale of the Montana ranch to the private equity firm today. The trap we were building was suddenly moving too slow. The countdown had accelerated from hours into minutes, and my son was currently standing at a closing table preparing to sign away Valerie's land before the sun reached its peak. The sharp vibration of the prepaid cellular phone against my thigh broke the oppressive silence of Bradley's office. I had purchased the burner device exactly an hour ago to ensure my communications remained entirely untraceable by Jordan's intrusive family tracking applications. I flipped the phone open. The gruff, panicked voice of Calvin, my fiercely loyal ranch foreman in Montana, filled the tiny speaker. He did not bother with pleasantries. He loudly announced that 3 heavy-duty diesel trucks bearing commercial surveying logos had just violently snapped the padlock off the main steel gate. They were actively driving heavy machinery across the pristine lower pasture. Calvin reported that a woman matching Heather's exact description was standing on the bed of a pickup truck. She wore pristine designer boots in the thick mud and held a rolled-up architectural blueprint. She was aggressively barking orders at the surveying crew, pointing toward the natural spring and the ancient timberline. She was acting with the supreme unearned confidence of a lawful owner. She told the crew where to place the demolition markers for the foundation of a commercial resort. The sheer audacity of her physical presence on my late wife's sanctuary sent a surge of hot, pure rage directly through my chest. Heather had not just forged my signature from 2,000 miles away in a sterile city apartment. She had chartered a private flight to Montana to personally oversee the desecration of Valerie's heritage. The corporate developers demanded an immediate geographical assessment before wiring the remaining purchase funds, and Heather was ensuring the timeline held firm. Calvin demanded instructions. His voice trembled with furious adrenaline. He stated he had his truck blocking the access road and requested permission to handle the trespassers immediately. He was ready to defend the property with his life. I needed to control the situation before blood was shed. Calvin offered to march down the muddy incline with his hunting rifle slung across his chest and forcefully run every single trespasser off the property. He promised to physically escort Heather back to the county highway and lock the gate behind her. I squeezed the plastic edge of the burner phone. The primal urge to let Calvin unleash his righteous anger burned fiercely in my throat. I wanted to authorize the confrontation. I wanted Heather to feel a fraction of the fear she had tried to instill in me when she brought the notary to my home. But I forced my lungs to draw a slow, deep breath. I closed my eyes and pictured Valerie. I remembered a freezing November morning 20 years ago. Valerie and I were crouched in the heavy snow tracking a massive buck through the dense pine forest. I had raised my rifle too early, aiming at a fleeting shadow behind the thick brush. Valerie gently pushed the cold steel barrel of my weapon down toward the frozen earth. She whispered that you never shoot at a shadow because you will only scatter the pack and ruin the hunt entirely. You wait in absolute stillness until the entire wolf steps completely out into the blinding light. You wait until there is no possible avenue for their escape. I opened my eyes and looked across the mahogany desk at Bradley. He gave a single firm nod of agreement. I spoke directly into the phone. I explicitly ordered Calvin to leave his rifle locked securely in the gun safe. I commanded him to stand down immediately and move his truck out of the main access road. I told him to let Heather and the commercial surveyors roam the property freely. Calvin protested loudly, unable to comprehend why I would surrender the land to invaders without a physical fight. I interrupted his protests with a cold, absolute tone. I explained that we were not surrendering a single blade of grass to these thieves. We were simply giving criminals the necessary rope required to hang themselves. I laid out a precise tactical operation for Calvin to execute immediately. I instructed him to gather the dozen high-definition motion sensor trail cameras we typically use to monitor the elk migration routes along the northern ridge. I ordered him to covertly deploy those cameras in a tight overlapping perimeter around the main log cabin and the exact boundaries where the surveyors were driving their wooden stakes into the soil. He possessed an intimate knowledge of the rugged terrain that the city-dwelling invaders lacked entirely. He could move through the dense tree line like a ghost. I told Calvin to transform this blatant home invasion into a comprehensive, undeniable surveillance operation. He understood the assignment instantly. The anger in his voice dissolved into the sharp focus of a soldier receiving direct orders from his commander. Over the next 4 hours, Calvin vanished into the woods. He secured the camouflage-patterned cameras high in the branches of the ancient pines and hidden deep within the thick brush overlooking the access roads. Every single movement Heather made, every unauthorized vehicle that crossed the property line, and every piece of heavy machinery brought onto the land was captured in crystal-clear digital resolution. We did not need to physically confront the trespassers to defeat them in a court of law. We needed them to act with absolute impunity. By allowing Heather to operate under the false assumption of total victory, she became careless. She dropped the carefully crafted facade she wore in the city. The trap was set perfectly in the shadows of the Montana wilderness. I sat in Bradley's office and waited for the digital snare to snap shut on her arrogance. My patience was anchored by 30 years of building structures from the ground up. I knew how to wait for concrete to cure, and I knew how to wait for a thief to make a fatal mistake. As the sun began to set over the city skyline outside Bradley's window, my burner phone buzzed with an incoming email notification. Calvin had successfully retrieved the memory cards from the trail perimeter and uploaded the encrypted files directly to a secure server. Bradley connected his laptop to the display monitor on his wall so we could review the evidence together. We clicked through dozens of images showing the surveying crew marking the land for a massive commercial resort. Then a specific photograph flashed onto the large screen that made Bradley sharply inhale. The high-definition image captured Heather standing beside a white municipal pickup truck parked near the riverbed. She was conversing with a man wearing the official uniform of the county zoning authority. The environmental protections on Valerie's ranch were notoriously strict, specifically designed to prevent commercial development near the fresh water supply. The trail camera captured the exact moment Heather reached into her oversized designer bag. She produced a thick, bulging manila envelope. The subsequent frame showed her handing the envelope directly to the uniformed inspector. The inspector tucked the cash into his jacket pocket and stamped his official seal onto her preliminary environmental impact report. Heather was not just trespassing and committing wire fraud. She was actively engaging in the blatant bribery of a government official to expedite the illegal sale. The photograph was the ultimate smoking gun. We had captured a federal crime in broad daylight. Before we could process the magnitude of the felony displayed on the screen, my burner phone vibrated again. Calvin sent a frantic text message regarding a secondary crisis. Simultaneously, my building superintendent sent an alert. Jordan had just bypassed the lobby security at my city apartment, carrying a manila folder of his own. The sharp metallic scrape of a key turning forcefully in the deadbolt shattered the heavy silence of my apartment. I had not given anyone permission to enter my home. The heavy wooden door swung open to reveal Jordan standing in my narrow entryway. He did not bother to knock or announce his sudden arrival. He stepped over the threshold with the absolute entitlement of a man who believed he owned the very floorboards beneath his expensive leather shoes. He carried no warmth in his expression, only a chilling, businesslike resolve. In his right hand, he clutched two distinct pieces of paper. He marched directly into my small living room and slapped both items onto the center of my coffee table. The heavy smack of paper against wood echoed sharply. The first item was a brightly colored, glossy brochure. The cheerful photographs on the cover depicted smiling seniors playing cards, but the fine print revealed it was for a notoriously decrepit, state-run nursing facility located on the polluted industrial outskirts of the city. The second item was a stark black-and-white legal document. It was a formal state-sanctioned 30-day eviction notice bearing my exact address and apartment number. The bold red letters at the top demanded my immediate and unconditional compliance. Jordan stood tall, arrogantly, adjusting the pristine cuffs of his tailored suit jacket. He stared down at me as if I were a helpless vagrant trespassing in his private corporate domain. He brought the bureaucratic machinery of forced displacement directly into the quiet sanctuary I had maintained for over 2 decades. The confrontation was no longer hovering on the distant horizon. The threat had marched directly through my front door, heavily armed with legal mandates and a glossy pamphlet promising rapid institutional decay. Jordan spoke to me with the slow, exaggerated rhythm a frustrated teacher might use to discipline an unruly toddler. He crossed his arms and delivered a coldly rehearsed speech about my rapidly deteriorating mental health. He claimed that my silent behavior at his wedding and my supposed inability to read simple documents the previous morning were undeniable proof of severe cognitive decline. He stated firmly that independent living was no longer a viable or safe option for me. He pointed sharply at the glossy brochure, insisting the state facility possessed the necessary medical staff to manage my impending dementia. I did not interrupt his deeply insulting monologue. I simply looked around the quiet, familiar walls of my apartment. I purchased this modest space 25 years ago. I worked grueling overtime shifts pouring heavy concrete through freezing winters to ensure I held the physical deed free and clear. I paid off the final mortgage installment 10 years ago, officially securing this permanent roof over my head. I looked down at the formal eviction notice resting on my coffee table. The legal heading listed a shell corporate holding company as the current lawful owner of my home. The devastating truth immediately locked into place. The forged power of attorney Heather filed that morning was not exclusively utilized to steal Valerie's Montana ranch. Jordan had ruthlessly deployed that fraudulent authority to instantly transfer the deed of my fully paid apartment into his own corporate portfolio. He had legally stolen the very walls surrounding us. He was actively evicting his own father to liquidate my home and funnel the cash toward his crushing $3 million private equity debt. He viewed my entire existence merely as a collection of assets waiting to be pawned. His condescension was a highly calculated tactic designed to break my spirit and force a rapid, unquestioning surrender. I did not raise my voice to match his overwhelming arrogance. I did not shout indignities or desperately defend my sanity against his entirely fabricated claims. Arguing with a man who has already decided to destroy you is a complete waste of vital energy. I looked at the glossy brochure detailing the depressing nursing home, then looked up at my son's expectant face. I nodded slowly, deliberately, projecting the exact image of a defeated, exhausted old man he desperately needed to see. I reached out and picked up the pamphlet, holding it with trembling hands to complete the elaborate illusion of my total surrender. I turned away from him and walked slowly toward my hallway closet. I pulled down a single weathered canvas suitcase and placed it flat on my mattress. I opened my dresser drawers and began folding my modest clothing in absolute heavy silence. I packed heavy flannel shirts, thick denim trousers, and my warmest winter boots. Jordan stood in the doorway of my bedroom, watching me pack with a smug, self-satisfied smile spreading across his face. He genuinely believed his ruthless intimidation tactics had worked perfectly. He believed he had successfully broken my spirit and secured my total compliance. My prolonged silence convinced him that I had accepted my miserable fate as a discarded burden. I zipped the heavy suitcase shut and locked the metal clasps with a definitive click. I did not shed a single tear for the sudden loss of my city apartment. Concrete and wood can always be replaced by honest labor, but a man's core dignity cannot be repurchased once it is willingly surrendered to tyrants. Jordan checked his smartphone, acknowledging a digital notification prompting him to move to his next objective. He casually informed me that a transport van from the state facility would arrive to collect me early tomorrow morning. He buttoned his suit jacket and proudly announced he was heading to a downtown corporate boardroom to finalize a series of highly lucrative real estate deals. He turned and walked out of my apartment, leaving the front door wide open behind him. I listened to his heavy footsteps echo down the corridor until the elevator doors chimed and swallowed him whole. The moment his physical presence faded, my fragile posture vanished entirely. I stood up straight, my spine rigid with absolute unwavering resolve. I grabbed the handle of my zipped suitcase and walked out of the apartment I would never see again. I pulled the front door shut, leaving my brass keys resting permanently on the kitchen counter. I did not call the local dispatch for a taxi to the state-run nursing home. I pulled my burner phone from my coat pocket and contacted a discreet private car service. I instructed the driver to bypass the city traffic entirely and take me directly to the international airport. I had anticipated this exact escalation and booked my travel itinerary days in advance. I bypassed the crowded commercial terminals and boarded a direct flight heading straight into the rugged heart of Montana. Jordan believed he had effectively neutralized me by stealing my apartment and casting me out. He had absolutely no idea he had just unleashed me into the vast wilderness where I held every single tactical advantage. I settled into my seat as the plane breached the heavy clouds, leaving the corrupt city and my old life far behind forever. The landing gear of the commercial airliner hit the tarmac in Bozeman with a heavy jolt. I disembarked into the crisp, thin mountain air, leaving the toxic atmosphere of the city thousands of miles behind me. A black luxury SUV idled by the perimeter fence of the small regional airport. Bradley sat in the driver's seat with the engine running. He had flown out on a private corporate charter hours before my commercial flight to ensure the legal battlefield was perfectly prepared for my arrival. I tossed my single canvas suitcase into the back seat and climbed into the passenger side. We did not exchange pleasantries or ask about each other's flights. Bradley drove us directly away from the commercial districts and deep into a remote, heavily wooded sector of the county. We arrived at a heavily fortified, off-the-grid legal office housed within a converted timber lodge. The facility was utilized exclusively by high-net-worth clients who required absolute discretion and impenetrable digital security to execute sensitive transactions. We walked into a windowless, soundproof conference room illuminated by harsh overhead lights. Bradley spread a massive, highly detailed architectural map of the 500-acre ranch across the polished pine table. He tapped his gold pen against a thick red circle drawn violently over the southern boundary. He informed me that our timeline had severely compressed overnight. Heather and Jordan had successfully submitted their falsified environmental impact reports to the county board. The commercial developers were fully satisfied with the bribed zoning inspector's green light and were aggressively pushing to close. We had exactly a 72-hour window before the buyers finalized the acquisition and began deploying heavy excavation machinery to tear into the earth. If we failed to build the legal firewall before that countdown hit zero, the developers would secure legitimate property rights, and the pristine landscape would be permanently lost to corporate greed. Bradley opened his secure leather briefcase and carefully extracted a single thick manila folder. He slid the original ironclad property deed across the pine table. I looked down at the heavy textured parchment. At the bottom of the page rested Valerie's elegant looping signature. She had signed that document with a trembling, frail hand exactly 2 weeks before her heart completely failed her. The blue ink seemed to radiate her fierce, protective spirit. Bradley looked me directly in the eye and delivered the harsh, absolute reality of our legal strategy. He stated that the only guaranteed method to completely neutralize Jordan's forged power of attorney was for me to proactively sever my own direct ownership of the estate. I had to permanently walk away from the property to save it from the bulldozers. I reached out and traced the raised notary seal next to my late wife's name. A vivid, deeply painful memory of Valerie's funeral rushed to the forefront of my mind. I remembered standing over her polished mahogany casket in the pouring rain. Jordan had stood beside me, checking his smartphone repeatedly, deeply annoyed by the length of the pastor's eulogy. He had not shed a single tear for the loving woman who gave him life. He was entirely consumed by the inheritance he believed was imminently coming his way. Valerie knew the rot inside his soul was incurable. She loved the Montana land because it was honest, wild, and entirely incapable of deception. I made my absolute decision in that quiet, windowless room. I chose to definitively honor the pristine spirit of the woman I loved for 40 years, rather than accommodate the biological son who viewed me as disposable trash. My bloodline had failed miserably, but my personal integrity would hold firm against the assault. I picked up Bradley's heavy gold pen. I did not let my hand shake or hesitate for a fraction of a second. I instructed Bradley to execute the absolute transfer of every single asset attached to the 500 acres. I carefully signed my name across a dozen dense legal pages, systematically moving the physical ranch, the highly lucrative underlying mineral deposits, and the vital, irreplaceable river water rights entirely out of my possession. We placed the entire estate into a highly fortified, irrevocable blind trust. I deliberately named a prominent, heavily funded local wildlife conservation charity as the sole and permanent beneficiary of the estate. The trust was structured with extreme legal aggression. It contained strict, unbreakable clauses permanently forbidding any future commercial development, land subdividing, or corporate logging on the premises. I legally stripped myself of all ownership and financial control over the property Valerie had entrusted to me. By legally removing my name from the master deed, I instantly rendered the forged power of attorney Jordan held in the city completely useless. Jordan could not legally sell land on behalf of a man who no longer owned it. The developer's contracts, Heather's cash bribes, and Jordan's blinding arrogance were now tethered to a completely worthless piece of paper. The conservation charity possessed a massive team of aggressive corporate lawyers who would fiercely defend their newly acquired sanctuary against any corporate intrusion. The land was permanently safe, shielded by a fortress of impenetrable legal armor. I set the gold pen down on the pine table, feeling a profound, heavy weight lift entirely from my weary shoulders. The land belonged to the wild once again. Bradley gathered the freshly signed documents and swiftly fed them through a secure digital scanner, uploading the irrevocable trust directly into the Federal Property Registry to permanently timestamp our victory. As the green loading bar on his laptop screen hit 100%, a secondary monitor on the desk emitted a sharp, blaring alert. Bradley had placed a covert digital tracker on the escrow account Jordan had registered for the commercial sale. Bradley leaned forward, his eyes quickly tracking the scrolling red text. He announced that the commercial developers, overly eager to secure the lucrative resort location and bypass rival bids, had just executed a massive premature financial maneuver. They had wired a $2 million non-refundable deposit directly into Jordan and Heather's joint banking account. The money cleared the institutional safeguards instantly. I watched the massive numbers stabilize on the screen, feeling a cold, calculating satisfaction wash over me. Jordan had actively utilized a demonstrably forged power of attorney document to solicit and accept massive funds across state lines. The exact moment that $2 million deposit landed securely in his metropolitan bank account, his crime violently escalated from a simple domestic property dispute into a massive, undeniable federal felony. He had unwittingly triggered severe interstate wire fraud statutes. The federal authorities possessed the jurisdiction to pursue him with absolute ruthless aggression. Jordan thought he had outsmarted a frail old man. He thought he had easily secured his financial salvation and erased his massive private equity debts. Instead, he had just firmly locked the federal shackles around his own wrists. I stood up from the pine table and buttoned my winter coat. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had completely crushed his entire future. 2,000 miles away in the city, the concrete basement of Jordan's corporate office building was completely deserted. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed loudly above the rows of expensive executive vehicles. Jordan walked briskly toward his leased luxury sedan, aggressively typing on his smartphone. He was entirely unaware of the dark gray van idling silently near the concrete exit ramp. As Jordan reached for his door handle, two large men in immaculate dark suits stepped out from the shadows of the concrete pillars. They moved with a terrifying synchronized efficiency. They did not shout or draw attention. They seamlessly flanked Jordan, pinning him tightly against the cold metal of his driver's side door. The taller man placed a heavy gloved hand directly onto Jordan's chest, completely halting his movements. The predator had finally cornered its prey. These were not traditional banking associates or legal clerks. They were high-level collection fixers employed by the predatory private equity firm that held Jordan's entire fabricated life in its jaws. The shorter man leaned in close, violating Jordan's personal space. He spoke in a low, even tone devoid of any human empathy. He demanded the immediate and total repayment of the $3 million principal balance. He casually informed Jordan that the firm's patience had completely evaporated. The continuous $12,000 interest payments stolen from my savings account were no longer sufficient to keep the wolves at bay. The men made it absolutely clear that if the full $3 million did not land in their offshore accounts immediately, Jordan would face severe and highly physical consequences that extended far beyond a ruined credit score. They squeezed him against the vehicle, waiting for his answer. I watched this entire hostile confrontation unfold in real time from the safety of Bradley's secure legal office in Montana. Bradley had deployed a top-tier private investigator to shadow Jordan's every move the moment we discovered the massive equity debt. The investigator had parked a discreet vehicle in the same concrete garage, transmitting a crystal-clear live video feed directly to Bradley's encrypted laptop. I sat in the leather chair, staring at the high-definition monitor. I watched my 35-year-old son press his back flat against his car, his face pale and slick with panicked sweat. A deeply buried memory forced its way into my mind. I saw Jordan at 6 years old, sitting on a shiny red bicycle in the local park. I remembered gripping the back of his small seat, running frantically alongside him down the paved path. My lungs had burned and my knees ached, but I refused to let go. I was terrified he would fall and scrape his skin on the rough asphalt. I spent my entire life running alongside him, absorbing the impacts of his mistakes, shielding him from the harsh gravity of the real world. I looked at the screen and realized my relentless protection had crippled his character. It was time to stop running. I made the conscious, difficult decision to finally let him fall. I watched the live feed as Jordan desperately raised his hands in surrender. His voice trembled visibly on the audio feed. He frantically promised the loan sharks that a massive multi-million-dollar commercial real estate sale was already secured. He swore to them that the non-refundable deposit was currently sitting in his account. He guaranteed the two men that the entire $3 million debt would be completely erased by Monday morning, immediately following the final closing table signatures. The men stared at him with dead eyes, gave him a final hard shove against the car door, and walked away into the shadows. The live feed abruptly cut to black as the fixers vanished from the corporate garage. I did not waste a single second dwelling on Jordan's pathetic display of cowardice. I turned to Bradley and instructed him to extract the high-resolution still frames from the investigator's video feed. We isolated the exact moments where Jordan was physically cornered by the known extortionists, clearly capturing the desperate financial conspiracy in motion. I took those printed photographs and laid them flat across the polished pine table. I reached into my leather satchel and retrieved the digital images Calvin had captured from the concealed trail cameras surrounding the ranch boundaries. I placed the crystal-clear photograph of Heather handing the thick manila envelope of bribe money to the uniformed county zoning inspector right beside the images of Jordan and the loan sharks. I meticulously aligned the documents. I was no longer merely a disappointed father protecting a piece of land. I was a structural engineer methodically compiling an undeniable criminal dossier. We possessed absolute visual proof of their extortion, their desperation, and their blatant bribery of a government official. The narrative was completely locked in place. They were attempting to illegally sell stolen property to pay off criminal syndicates, utilizing forged documents and corrupted municipal authorities to grease the wheels. I instructed Bradley to bind these photographs together with the finalized blind trust documents and the proof of the forged notary stamp. We built a lethal, inescapable paper trail. The trap was now fully armed, loaded with enough federal evidence to dismantle their entire fraudulent existence in a matter of minutes. I stacked the files neatly, feeling the cold, hard weight of absolute justice resting under my hands. 2,000 miles away, Heather confidently strode down the narrow hallway of my city apartment building. She clutched a sleek digital tablet containing aggressive renovation plans and expensive interior design mock-ups. She believed I was sitting in a depressing state-run medical facility, thoroughly defeated and stripped of my assets. She slid the forged spare key into the deadbolt and pushed the heavy door open, expecting to find the pathetic remnants of my long life waiting to be tossed into a commercial dumpster. She stepped inside and froze completely. The apartment was entirely empty. The walls were stripped bare, the closets were hollow, and the air was dead and sterile. There was no trace of the confused, broken old man she had aggressively bullied. Panic instantly flared in her chest. The quiet emptiness did not signify surrender. It heavily implied a calculated disappearance. Her hands shook as she dropped her digital tablet onto the bare kitchen counter. She pulled out her smartphone and frantically opened the family tracking application she had secretly installed on my cellular plan months ago, under the guise of an emergency health monitor. She typed in her administrative password and waited for the map to load. She fully expected the tracking beacon to ping somewhere deep within the city limits. Instead, the digital map zoomed out rapidly, crossing state lines and vast geographical distances. A bright red dot materialized on her screen, pulsing steadily. It was not resting anywhere near a nursing home. The beacon flashed exactly on the GPS coordinates of Valerie's 500-acre Montana ranch. The color instantly drained from Heather's face as the horrifying truth crashed down upon her. The old man was not senile. He knew absolutely everything, and he was already standing on the battlefield waiting for them. The deep, aggressive growl of a high-performance engine shattered the absolute stillness of the Montana afternoon. A massive black luxury SUV tore up the long, winding dirt road leading directly to the main log cabin. Thick clouds of dry dust plumed violently behind the heavy tires, coating the surrounding pine trees in a layer of pale grit. The vehicle skidded sharply as it hit the gravel driveway. Heather slammed the heavy transmission into park before the wheels had completely stopped moving. She threw the driver's side door open and marched out into the crisp mountain air. She did not wear the elegant silk gowns or tailored boardroom suits she favored in the city. She wore brand-new, stiff designer outdoor clothing, purchased specifically for the aesthetic of a wealthy landowner inspecting her recent acquisition. Her face was flushed with a toxic mixture of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated rage. She had flown across the country, propelled entirely by the terrifying realization that her absolute control over the situation was rapidly disintegrating. She marched purposefully toward the wide wooden steps of the main porch. She did not bother to knock or announce her presence with any degree of common decency. She immediately began screaming at the top of her lungs, her shrill voice echoing harshly across the serene valley. She demanded that the ranch foreman show himself instantly. She commanded him to surrender the master keys to the property without a single moment of delay. She loudly proclaimed herself the sole lawful owner of the 500-acre estate, insisting that her corporate developers required immediate, unrestricted access to the primary residence. She stood at the base of the wooden stairs, clutching a thick leather portfolio to her chest, expecting a hired hand to emerge and bow to her aggressive authority. The heavy, solid oak front door of the cabin groaned loudly on its iron hinges. The thick wood swung inward, revealing the dark interior of the house. I stepped slowly out onto the wide, wraparound porch, my heavy work boots thudding firmly against the timber planks. I held my grandfather's antique 12-gauge shotgun resting casually by my right side. The rusted steel barrel was pointed safely and deliberately toward the packed dirt beneath the porch. My grandfather had carried that exact weapon to defend his own meager plot of farmland in the deep South, decades before I was even born. He taught me that a man only picks up a tool of defense when he is absolutely prepared to protect his family's foundation from those who seek to destroy it. I did not raise the weapon. I merely let its heavy historical presence speak for my unwavering resolve. Heather stopped dead in her tracks at the base of the stairs. The aggressive, entitled shouting caught violently in her throat. Her eyes widened to the size of coins as she stared up at me. She had fully expected to find a subservient ranch hand easily intimidated by city threats and corporate jargon. More importantly, she expected me to be sedated, confused, and locked safely away in a depressing state-run nursing facility back on the East Coast. She had constructed her entire multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy on the fatal assumption that I was a broken compliant victim entirely incapable of defending my own territory. She did not face a senile old man suffering from cognitive decline. She faced a stoic, deeply rooted landowner standing squarely on the very soil he had sworn to protect. The sudden, shocking reality of my physical presence in Montana completely paralyzed her. The arrogant, wealthy socialite facade cracked instantly, revealing the desperate, cornered fraudster hiding underneath. I stood motionless on the elevated porch, letting the cold mountain wind whip around my heavy canvas jacket, waiting for her to process the catastrophic failure of her ambush. I looked down at the woman who had married my only son. I did not express an ounce of anger or surprise. I informed her in a perfectly calm, low voice that she was actively trespassing on private property. My words cut through the thin mountain air like the sharp crack of a leather whip. I told her she had exactly 1 minute to return to her rented vehicle and drive back through the front gates before I notified the local authorities of a hostile intrusion. The direct challenge to her authority caused her inherent arrogance to violently flare back to life. Her initial shock morphed into vicious, defensive hostility. She refused to accept defeat after traveling 2,000 miles to secure her financial salvation. Heather forcefully ripped open the zipper of her designer leather bag. She plunged her hand inside and retrieved a thick stack of stapled papers. She pulled the fraudulently executed master deed into the light, gripping it tightly in her manicured fist. She waved the forged document in the air, like a lethal weapon, aggressively pointing the sharp edges of the paper toward my face. She shouted that my threats were completely meaningless. She declared that Jordan held my absolute legal power of attorney and had lawfully transferred the entire estate into her sole possession. She loudly insisted the land beneath my feet belonged entirely to her corporate holding company. She demanded I step aside and vacate the premises immediately, blindly relying on a piece of paper she believed held ultimate power over my life. She stood her ground, her chest heaving with indignation. She informed me that if I did not drop the antique shotgun and surrender the cabin, she would summon the police to forcefully remove a violent squatter from her newly acquired real estate. I did not react to her empty ultimatums. I simply stared at her, an immovable object rooted deeply into the porch of the log cabin. My absolute refusal to retreat completely shattered her final sliver of patience. Heather realized her aggressive posturing was entirely ineffective against a man who refused to play her corporate games. She immediately pivoted to her most dangerous and manipulative tactic. She unlocked her smartphone and dialed 911 with rapid, furious keystrokes. She pressed the device tightly against her ear and turned slightly away from me. The moment the emergency dispatcher answered the call, Heather underwent a terrifying, instantaneous theatrical transformation. Her posture crumpled. Her voice pitched upward into a high trembling register. She expertly manufactured a series of hyperventilating, hysterical tears. She wept directly into the receiver, painting a vivid, horrifying picture of an innocent victim trapped in a nightmare. She told the county dispatcher that she had arrived to inspect her newly purchased property only to be ambushed by her severely mentally ill father-in-law. She fed the operator a carefully crafted narrative, claiming I had suffered a catastrophic psychological break, stolen a deadly firearm, and was currently pointing a loaded shotgun directly at her chest. She sobbed loudly, begging the police to send heavily armed units immediately because she genuinely feared for her life on her own land. She hung up the phone and wiped the fake tears from her cheeks, replacing them with a cold, victorious smirk. She believed she had just weaponized the local law enforcement against me, forcing a deadly confrontation that would end with my permanent incarceration or my death. The distant wail of sirens quickly morphed into a deafening roar as two county sheriff cruisers tore up the long, winding dirt driveway. Their red and blue emergency lights sliced violently through the thick curtain of dry dust Heather's luxury SUV had kicked up moments earlier. The heavy vehicles skidded to an aggressive tactical halt just yards from the base of my porch, positioning their reinforced steel frames as protective shields. 4 officers leaped from the cruisers simultaneously. Their movements were sharp-trained and highly coordinated. Their hands rested firmly on their holsters, their eyes frantically scanning the immediate perimeter for the active armed threat the emergency dispatcher had relayed. Heather immediately seized the chaotic moment to amplify her fabricated narrative. She threw herself toward the nearest cruiser, dramatically pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. She screamed with a perfectly rehearsed, shrill panic, demanding they arrest the dangerous, deranged old man immediately. She sobbed violently, claiming I had ambushed her, stolen a lethal weapon, and threatened to brutally end her life on the very property she supposedly owned. She clutched the hood of the police cruiser, burying her face in her hands, presenting the flawless image of a terrified, defenseless victim narrowly escaping a violent tragedy. She wailed about her safety, demanding I be placed in handcuffs and hauled away to a psychiatric ward. The younger officers immediately tensed their stances, widening, as they assessed the imposing figure I cut on the elevated wooden porch. The tension in the thin mountain air was absolutely suffocating. A single sudden movement could trigger a catastrophic, irreversible chain of events. Heather continued her hysterical weeping, completely convinced her theatrical performance had successfully manipulated the armed authorities into executing her ruthless bidding and clearing her path to the millions she desperately needed. I did not allow a single pulse of panic to enter my bloodstream. I possessed the absolute clarity of a man standing firmly on the side of irrefutable truth. I slowly and deliberately knelt, placing my grandfather's antique 12-gauge shotgun completely flat against the wooden deck boards. I stood back up, raised my empty hands to shoulder height, and walked methodically down the wide porch stairs, with my palms clearly visible. I maintained a steady, non-threatening pace, allowing the officers to visually confirm I was unarmed and completely compliant. As I reached the gravel driveway, the lead officer stepped out from behind the reinforced door of the primary cruiser. The harsh sunlight illuminated the weathered, familiar face of Sheriff Miller. The deep lines around his eyes relaxed the absolute second his gaze locked onto mine. The hostile tension radiating from his rigid posture evaporated into the Montana breeze. Sheriff Miller and I shared a profound, unspoken history. We had spent the better part of the last 20 years standing shoulder to shoulder in the freezing, rushing waters of the Yellowstone River, casting fly fishing lines at dawn and discussing the quiet complexities of raising sons. He knew the absolute measure of my character, and I knew his. He signaled for his deputies to stand down, lowering his hand safely away from his heavy duty belt. He stepped past a highly confused and visibly frustrated Heather, walking directly toward me. He did not issue a barked command or force me against a vehicle. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked at me with genuine, deep concern. He stated that the emergency dispatch reported a violent, mentally unstable squatter wielding a stolen firearm against a legitimate property owner. He then asked me with the calm respect owed to a lifelong friend and a deeply rooted member of the local community to explain exactly why a frantic city woman was standing in my driveway, waving a stack of legal papers. I lowered my hands and reached slowly into the deep inner pocket of my heavy canvas jacket. I retrieved the thick, professionally bound legal dossier Bradley and I had meticulously assembled just hours prior at the secure off-the-grid facility. I handed Sheriff Miller the certified copies of the irrevocable blind trust documents. The heavy parchment prominently featured the official raised federal watermarks legally verifying the permanent transfer of the entire 500-acre estate to the local wildlife conservation charity. I then produced the high-resolution digital photographs Calvin had captured from the concealed trail cameras. I placed the undeniable visual evidence of Heather handing a bulging manila envelope of cash directly to the uniformed county zoning inspector right on top of the legal trust paperwork. Sheriff Miller took the dossier and flipped through the pages in absolute silence. His seasoned eyes scanned the federal seals and the damning surveillance photographs. His jaw tightened and his expression hardened into a mask of pure, authoritative fury. The narrative was instantly and completely rewritten in his mind. He turned sharply away from me and marched directly toward Heather. Her fake, hysterical sobbing ceased instantly under his blistering, uncompromising glare. Sheriff Miller did not mince his words. He sternly informed her that the property she stood on belonged entirely to a federal wildlife trust, and that her forged deed was a completely worthless piece of paper. He leaned in close, his voice a low, intimidating growl, warning her that filing a highly fabricated false police report to manipulate armed officers carried severe criminal penalties. He explicitly detailed how attempting to execute a fraudulent real estate transaction involving bribed municipal officials triggered massive, inescapable federal wire fraud and forgery statutes. He informed her that she was standing completely exposed in a jurisdiction that did not tolerate corporate criminals, and she was seconds away from wearing steel handcuffs. The absolute reality of her catastrophic failure slammed into Heather with the force of a runaway freight train. The arrogant, wealthy socialite facade entirely disintegrated, leaving behind raw, undisguised terror. She did not attempt to argue with the seasoned law enforcement officer or defend the authenticity of her forged documents. She spun on her expensive designer heels, practically throwing herself into the driver's seat of her rented luxury SUV. She slammed the heavy door shut, threw the transmission into reverse, and aggressively pressed the accelerator. The vehicle fishtailed violently backward, kicking up a massive cloud of dirt and gravel before tearing recklessly down the winding mountain road. She fled the property like a hunted animal, desperately trying to outrun the massive legal avalanche crashing down behind her. The moment she cleared the ranch's front gates, she connected her smartphone to the vehicle's Bluetooth system and frantically dialed Jordan's private number. Her voice shook with genuine, unadulterated panic as she informed her husband that the old man was not senile. The property was legally untouchable, and the local sheriff possessed hard visual evidence of her municipal bribery. Jordan's terrified voice echoed through the car speakers. The loan sharks were actively demanding their $3 million, and the federal authorities were undoubtedly moving to freeze their accounts based on the impending wire fraud charges. They were completely out of time and thoroughly out of options. In a desperate final gamble, they agreed to wildly accelerate the commercial closing table meeting to that exact afternoon. They intended to legally blindside the eager corporate developers, cash the massive non-refundable $2 million deposit check, and immediately flee the country before the rural Montana jurisdiction could effectively process and distribute the federal arrest warrants. They were abandoning the elaborate real estate scheme and making a frantic sprint for sheer survival. The climate-controlled air inside the glass-walled boardroom felt artificially thin. High above the chaotic pulse of the city, the sprawling corner office offered a panoramic view of the financial district, completely insulated from the desperate reality on the streets below. Jordan and Heather sat rigidly across a massive polished mahogany table from the lead commercial developers. Heather had barely managed to secure a seat on a commercial red-eye flight out of Bozeman, arriving at the corporate headquarters straight from the airport. Her usually flawless designer attire was visibly rumpled, and a frantic, nervous energy radiated from her every movement. She kept her hands firmly locked together in her lap to hide their violent trembling. Jordan mirrored her suppressed panic, his posture stiff, and his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles fluttered beneath his skin. The final binding purchase agreement rested heavily on the center of the dark wood table, representing the absolute culmination of their elaborate multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy. The document was neatly tabbed with bright yellow adhesive markers indicating the exact lines requiring immediate signatures. The two lead developers, dressed in immaculate charcoal suits, casually reviewed the final addendums with the relaxed confidence of men accustomed to buying up pristine landscapes for sheer corporate profit. They were entirely oblivious to the monumental fraud actively unfolding right before their eyes. The senior developer smiled warmly, expressing his complete satisfaction with the expedited timeline. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and retrieved a heavy silver-plated fountain pen. He smoothly uncapped the expensive instrument, the metallic click echoing sharply across the silent boardroom. He slid the thick stack of legal parchment directly across the polished mahogany toward Jordan, signaling the final point of no return. Jordan reached his right hand out toward the pristine legal document. His fingers shook with a subtle but undeniable tremor. He desperately gripped the edge of the paper to steady himself. His entire fabricated existence was currently hanging by a rapidly fraying thread. The violent encounter in the concrete parking garage played on a continuous, terrifying loop in the back of his mind. The loan sharks had made their brutal intentions absolutely clear. If the $3 million private equity debt was not completely zeroed out by Monday morning, Jordan would lose much more than his fraudulent corporate titles. He stared blindly at the stark black ink on the signature line. He vividly remembered the bitter resentment he harbored as a teenager, watching me return to our modest apartment, covered in the gray dust of the construction sites. I had spent countless weekend hours teaching him how to ride a bicycle in the local park, running alongside him, gripping the seat to ensure he never fell and scraped his knees. He deeply despised the slow, grueling nature of honest labor I tried to instill in him. He always demanded the immediate shortcut to the corner office, recklessly leveraging his entire financial future to purchase a partnership tier he had entirely failed to earn. This single signature, would instantly validate his reckless ambition, permanently erase his massive debts, and secure his glittering facade of wealth. He picked up the silver pen provided by the developer. He took a short, jagged breath and pressed the sharp metal nib directly against the signature line. A single drop of black ink bled into the thick parchment. The heavy, solid oak doors of the boardroom suddenly swung inward with explosive, terrifying velocity. The thick wood hit the glass walls with a deafening, violent crack that reverberated through the entire corporate suite like a gunshot. I strode directly into the expansive room, bringing the freezing, uncompromising gravity of the Montana mountains straight into their sterile corporate sanctuary. I did not wear the faded flannel shirts and heavy denim trousers I had packed in my canvas suitcase. I did not wear the worn, outdated charcoal suit I had worn to Jordan's disastrous, humiliating wedding reception. I wore a sharply tailored dark navy suit purchased that very morning from an exclusive city boutique before arriving at the corporate headquarters. The expensive fabric draped perfectly across my shoulders, projecting the undeniable grounded authority of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Bradley flanked my right side, matching my purposeful stride. He carried his secure leather briefcase and wore the cold, lethal expression of a corporate assassin, closing in for the final kill. I did not break my stride or hesitate as the startled occupants of the room turned to face the sudden intrusion. I walked directly to the center of the polished mahogany table, placing my hands flat against the cold wood. Jordan dropped the silver pen. It clattered loudly against the table and rolled onto the carpet. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. Heather let out a short, involuntary gasp, pressing her hand over her mouth. They stared at me with the absolute paralyzing horror of criminals watching the ghosts of their victims suddenly walk through the front door. They had spent months treating me like an invisible, disposable asset, manipulating my life from the shadows. I was no longer a silent, compliant old man waiting to be quietly shuffled into a decrepit nursing facility. I was the master of my own fate, standing squarely in the center of their domain. The senior commercial developer immediately jumped up from his leather executive chair, his face flushed with deep, indignant corporate outrage at the blatant breach of security. He aggressively demanded to know who had authorized this unprecedented interruption of a highly confidential financial closing. He threatened to summon the building security and have us physically removed from the premises instantly. I completely ignored Jordan and Heather's panicked existence. I slowly turned my head and looked the aggressive developer straight in the eye. My gaze was completely devoid of any intimidation or fear. I matched his corporate hostility with the absolute freezing calm of irrefutable truth. I did not raise my voice or engage in a shouting match. I informed him in a flat, clinical tone that building security was the absolute least of his current problems. I told the developer he was precisely 30 seconds away from wiring $20 million of his company's capital directly into the offshore accounts of a desperate fraudster. I pointed a steady finger directly at Jordan's trembling figure. I explicitly stated that the man sitting across from him did not own a single blade of grass on the Montana ranch. I revealed that the power of attorney documents resting on the mahogany table were entirely forged, and the land they were attempting to purchase was permanently locked inside an irrevocable federal blind trust. The developer's aggressive posture instantly evaporated, replaced by a sharp, calculating shock. He looked down at the purchase agreement, then looked across the table at Jordan's terrified, sweating face. The hook was set perfectly deep within the corporate machinery. The massive financial institutions suddenly realized they were the primary targets of a colossal criminal con. The danger facing Jordan instantly multiplied, shifting from my righteous anger to the ruthless retaliation of a cheated corporate empire. Jordan's carefully constructed world imploded the exact moment the heavy oak doors crashed against the glass walls of the corporate boardroom. The color entirely drained from his face, replaced instantly by a flushed, violent crimson tide of absolute panic. He shot up from his leather executive chair with such explosive force that the heavy piece of furniture tipped backward, hitting the plush carpet with a muffled thud. He pointed a trembling, sweating finger directly at my chest. His voice cracked as he frantically shouted to the room that I was suffering from severe advanced dementia. He aggressively spun toward the lead commercial developer, his words spilling out in a rapid, chaotic torrent of desperate lies. He claimed I was a deeply delusional, dangerous old man who had somehow escaped from a secure, state-run medical facility. He insisted that my sudden physical presence was nothing more than a pathetic, tragic psychological episode and was completely irrelevant to the lucrative real estate transaction at hand. Jordan then turned his manic, wide-eyed attention to the bewildered executive receptionist standing frozen in the hallway. He barked a furious command, demanding she summon armed building security immediately. He demanded they utilize physical force to remove the deranged trespasser from the corporate premises before I could disrupt the multi-million-dollar closing any further. He slammed his fist against the polished mahogany table, desperately attempting to assert a dominance he simply no longer possessed. He was completely unhinged, acting with the frantic, cornered energy of a predator that suddenly realizes it has stepped directly into a set steel trap. He genuinely believed his loud, authoritative volume could somehow drown out the freezing reality of my presence. I did not engage with his hysterical, high-pitched screaming. I did not attempt to loudly defend my own sanity or argue against his pathetic, entirely fabricated accusations. I vividly remembered standing in the sterile office of his high school principal when Jordan was just 15 years old. He had been caught red-handed stealing exam answers from a teacher's locked desk. Even then, backed completely into a corner, with undeniable physical proof resting right in front of him, he had screamed, deflected, and aggressively blamed everyone else in the room for his own deliberate actions. He had always relied heavily on a combination of loud indignation and aggressive deflection to escape the consequences of his choices. I had foolishly bailed him out of that office, paying for expensive private tutors and quietly smoothing over the damaged institutional relationships. I had inadvertently taught him that his actions lacked permanent real-world consequences. That devastating parental error ended completely today. I simply took a single deliberate step to my left, clearing the center of the stage. I allowed Bradley to step forward. Bradley moved with the calculated predatory efficiency of a legal executioner. He raised his heavy leather briefcase and brought it down hard. He dropped a massive, heavily bound legal binder directly on top of the final purchase agreement. The loud, sharp slap of thick leather against polished mahogany echoed like a gunshot, instantly silencing Jordan's frantic shouting. The absolute finality of the sound sucked the remaining oxygen entirely out of the boardroom. Bradley did not utter a single word. He systematically unclasped the binder and began rapidly distributing the pristine documents to every commercial developer seated at the table. He slid certified, watermarked copies of the irrevocable blind trust establishing the wildlife sanctuary directly in front of the senior executives. He followed this instantly with the crystal-clear, high-definition trail camera photographs of Heather brazenly handing a thick envelope of cash to the uniformed county zoning inspector. Finally, he distributed the verified sworn affidavits, confirming the absolute forgery of the notary stamp utilized on Jordan's fraudulent power of attorney. The lead developer did not look at Jordan or Heather. He stared intensely down at the glossy surveillance photographs and the heavily watermarked federal trust documents resting on the table in front of him. He slowly picked up the first page of the legal dossier. The silence in the glass-walled boardroom became so absolute, the faint hum of the city traffic far below seemed to vanish entirely. I watched the senior executive's eyes rapidly scan the precise, undeniable legal language stripping my ownership and permanently transferring the 500 acres of Montana wilderness into a heavily protected federal conservation charity. The developer's face turned an immediate sickly shade of ash white. The sophisticated corporate swagger entirely abandoned his posture. He was a man who specialized in highly aggressive land acquisitions, deeply familiar with the severe nuances of real estate law. He possessed the immediate, terrifying comprehension to realize exactly what these documents represented. He understood with absolute clarity that his massive corporation had been mere seconds from wiring $20 million to purchase completely stolen land. He realized that proceeding with this transaction would have instantly implicated his entire firm in a massive interstate conspiracy involving forged deeds, municipal bribery, and severe federal wire fraud. The legal fallout would have completely dismantled his corporate empire and resulted in immediate federal indictments for everyone currently sitting at the table. He dropped the blind trust documents as if the paper itself were physically burning his fingers. He lunged across the mahogany table with sudden, violent corporate aggression. He fiercely snatched the final purchase agreement completely away from Jordan's side of the desk, pulling the silver pen along with it. The lead developer stood towering over the table, his chest heaving with unrestrained, furious corporate rage. He pointed a lethal, uncompromising finger directly at Jordan's chest, completely ignoring the fabricated claims of my dementia. The executive's voice dropped into a low, dangerous register that promised absolute, unparalleled destruction. He demanded the immediate and unconditional return of the $2 million non-refundable deposit his firm had wired directly into Jordan's joint account the previous afternoon. He stated clearly that if the funds were not completely reversed and resting safely in his corporate holding account, within the next 60 seconds, his elite legal team would contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation before anyone left the glass boardroom. Jordan staggered backward, his expensive leather shoes catching awkwardly on the plush corporate carpet, his knees visibly buckled beneath his sharply tailored suit. The arrogant, wealthy facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He raised his hands in a pathetic, trembling gesture of total surrender. He looked frantically between the furious commercial developer, his pale, horrified wife, and my stoic, unyielding expression. He stammered uncontrollably, his voice reduced to a broken, high-pitched wheeze of pure terror. He confessed the absolute horrifying reality of his financial destruction to the entire room. He admitted with tears streaming down his face that he did not possess the $2 million. He revealed that he had already wired the entire deposit sum offshore to the private equity loan sharks the very moment the funds had cleared his bank. He sobbed openly, confessing that he had sent the stolen money to stop the violent debt collectors from tracking him down and breaking his legs in the concrete parking garage. The room plunged into a terrifying, deadly silence as the sheer magnitude of his irreversible federal crime settled permanently over the closing table. The suffocating silence inside the boardroom shattered under the immense, crushing weight of absolute ruin. The lead commercial developer did not waste a single breath on useless corporate shouting or emotional outbursts. He recognized the immediate, terrifying severity of the situation. His prestigious firm had just been actively defrauded of $2 million, and the stolen capital was currently sitting entirely out of reach in the offshore accounts of a violent extortion syndicate. He completely bypassed his internal legal department and reached directly into his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out his smartphone with the ruthless, practiced efficiency of an executive initiating a hostile corporate takeover. He did not dial the local police dispatch or a standard corporate attorney. He maintained a direct, high-level contact list for severe, catastrophic financial emergencies. He dialed the personal mobile number of the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He paced the length of the expansive glass wall, his voice echoing with cold, uncompromising authority. He explicitly reported a multi-million-dollar interstate wire fraud in active progress. He provided the federal director with Jordan's full legal name, the exact details of the forged Montana property deed, and the specific routing numbers of the compromised escrow accounts. He demanded immediate federal intervention to aggressively trace the stolen corporate funds and freeze every single financial asset attached to Jordan's corporate profile. The sheer speed and raw power of the corporate retaliation materialized right before our eyes. The developer was not simply terminating a real estate transaction. He was unleashing the full, devastating force of the federal government directly onto Jordan's shoulders. The digital gears of the federal justice system began turning before the developer even ended the brief call. The boardroom was no longer a space for negotiation. It had instantly transformed into a locked federal crime scene. Heather watched the commercial developer abruptly end the phone call. The horrific reality of a massive federal indictment crashed entirely over her meticulously manicured facade. Her deeply ingrained survival instinct engaged with violent animalistic speed. The lavish lifestyle she had ruthlessly pursued, the expensive designer clothing, the exclusive high society circles, and the impending Montana resort, millions, instantly evaporated into the terrifying prospect of a lengthy federal prison sentence. She did not hesitate for a single loyal second. She violently physically recoiled from Jordan as if he were suddenly carrying a highly contagious disease. She pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at her husband's pale, sweating face. Her voice pitched into a hysterical, piercing shriek that completely shattered the remaining decorum of the corporate suite. She frantically screamed to the room that the entire fraudulent conspiracy was entirely Jordan's exclusive design from the very beginning. She aggressively threw him directly to the encroaching federal wolves, loudly claiming she possessed absolutely no knowledge of the forged notary stamp, the fabricated environmental reports, or the bribery of the county zoning inspector. She desperately attempted to distance herself from the catastrophic legal fallout, violently sobbing that she was merely an innocent spouse completely manipulated by a desperate, debt-ridden husband. Jordan remained frozen on his knees, staring blankly up at the woman he had married. Their entire union had been carefully constructed on a hollow foundation of mutual greed and superficial ambition. He had willingly alienated his own father and participated in the ruthless theft of a family sanctuary to satisfy her relentless demands for elevated social status. Now facing absolute destruction, he watched her completely sever their legal and emotional bond without a fraction of remorse. She was actively offering him up as the sole sacrificial lamb to save her own personal freedom. The total betrayal mirrored the exact cruelty Jordan had inflicted upon me, completing a vicious, inescapable cycle of treachery. He watched his entire world disintegrate, completely abandoned by the very person for whom he had sacrificed his moral compass, completely abandoned by his frantic wife and actively hunted by federal authorities. Jordan turned his terrified, tear-streaked face toward the only direction he had ever looked for unconditional salvation. He shifted his weight on the plush corporate carpet and crawled directly toward my polished leather shoes. He completely abandoned whatever remaining shreds of dignity or corporate pride he possessed. He grabbed the fabric of my trousers, his hands shaking violently, his knuckles white with absolute desperation. He looked up at me with the exact same panicked, pleading expression he wore as a child whenever he broke a neighbor's window or failed a critical school examination. He fully expected the reliable, unbreakable parental safety net to deploy instantly. He sobbed openly, his tears soaking the knees of my Navy suit. He begged me to contact my bank and liquidate my entire retirement pension immediately. He frantically calculated aloud that my life savings, combined with the forced rapid sale of my few remaining assets, could potentially cover the missing $2 million. He pleaded with me to wire the funds directly to the commercial developers to immediately stop the impending federal prosecution. He desperately invoked the past, forcefully reminding me of the grueling overtime shifts I had worked pouring freezing concrete to pay for his elite university tuition. He essentially demanded that the man who had sacrificed his physical health to build his foundational life must now completely sacrifice his ultimate survival to erase a massive self-inflicted criminal debt. He clung tightly to my legs, waiting for the familiar comforting assurance that I would absorb the devastating impact of his reckless choices one final time. He firmly believed a father's duty was absolute, even in the face of monumental betrayal. I looked down at the weeping, shattered man clutching my trousers. I searched my heart for the familiar heavy surge of parental obligation that had governed my entire adult existence. I found absolutely nothing. There was no lingering anger, no residual pity, and no trace of mercy. The deep well of my unconditional forgiveness had been completely and permanently drained the precise moment he walked into my apartment, and handed me a fraudulent eviction notice to steal my home. I did not bend down to comfort him. I did not reach out to smooth his disheveled hair or offer empty reassurances. I maintained a rigid, unyielding posture, serving as an immovable pillar of cold reality. I looked him straight in the eyes, allowing the freezing truth to completely extinguish his frantic, desperate hope. I delivered the crushing verdict with a low, perfectly steady voice that reverberated through the silent boardroom. I stated clearly and absolutely that I would not pay a single, solitary cent to clean up the catastrophic wreckage of his immense greed. I informed him that the lifetime supply of endless bailouts and silent sacrifices had officially expired. I commanded him to release my clothing immediately. I told him to stand up on his own 2 feet and finally face the devastating consequences of his actions like a grown man. I completely severed the invisible tether that had bound my parental duty to his basic survival. I stepped back deliberately, forcing his grasping hands to fall empty onto the corporate carpet. I watched him fully absorb the sheer terrifying gravity of true independence, entirely alone and completely out of time. The protective shadow I had cast over him for 35 years vanished, exposing him entirely to the burning light of federal justice. The deafening silence inside the boardroom broke violently as a chorus of high-pitched sirens began to wail from the city streets far below. The sound echoed up through the concrete canyons of the financial district, piercing the thick, soundproofed glass of the executive suite. The lead commercial developer stood rigidly by the expansive window, his phone still clutched in his hand, watching the flashing red and blue lights converge directly at the base of the corporate headquarters. Jordan remained completely paralyzed on the floor, his mind entirely unable to process the sheer velocity of his impending doom. He had spent his entire adult life successfully outrunning the consequences of his arrogance, relying on my silent financial sacrifices to construct his illusion of invincibility. That illusion shattered permanently when the heavy, polished oak doors of the boardroom burst open with terrifying, coordinated force. A team of heavily armed federal agents stormed into the pristine space. They moved with a ruthless, kinetic efficiency that instantly dismantled the sterile corporate atmosphere. Their dark tactical gear clashed violently against the luxurious mahogany and brushed steel of the room. The lead agent barked sharp, uncompromising commands, instantly seizing total control of the environment. The commercial developers immediately backed away, raising their hands in clear gestures of non-interference. The pristine boardroom designed for executing lucrative corporate acquisitions instantly dissolved into absolute unrestrained chaos. The meticulously constructed world Jordan and Heather had built on a foundation of forgery and deceit collapsed under the heavy boots of federal law enforcement. The agents did not hesitate to identify their primary targets. They possessed the exact names, the forged documents, and the irrefutable digital trail of the stolen $2 million. The sheer speed of the federal response reflected the severe magnitude of the interstate wire fraud. Jordan knelt on the plush carpet, trembling violently, a cornered fraudster entirely stripped of his arrogant disguise. 2 federal agents moved rapidly across the room, closing the distance to Jordan before he could even attempt to stand. They hauled him forcefully off the carpet by the shoulders of his sharply tailored suit. Jordan let out a pathetic, high-pitched gasp as they spun him around and slammed his chest forcefully against the edge of the massive mahogany table. The silver-plated fountain pen he had intended to use to seal my financial ruin rolled off the polished surface and fell silently to the floor. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed sharply through the room. Heather witnessed her husband being physically subdued, and her deeply ingrained selfish survival instinct instantly overrode her paralyzing shock. She did not rush to his side or offer a single word of support. She completely abandoned the man she had manipulated for years. She spun around and frantically sprinted toward the secondary exit of the boardroom, her designer heels sinking into the thick carpet. She desperately believed she could somehow outrun a federal indictment by simply fleeing the immediate crime scene. Her desperate flight was cut short instantly. A massive federal agent blocked the narrow doorway, completely absorbing the impact of her frantic momentum. He grabbed her wrists forcefully, twisting her arms behind her back. Heather thrashed wildly against the agent's unyielding grip, her expensive silk blouse tearing at the shoulder. She shrieked in absolute fury as the cold steel cuffs locked around her own wrists, anchoring her permanently to the catastrophic reality she had engineered. She realized instantly that the luxurious, untouchable life she felt inherently entitled to was completely over. She whipped her head around her perfectly styled hair, falling wildly across her face. She locked her furious, terrified eyes directly onto mine. She spat venomous, hateful curses across the room, screaming that I had maliciously destroyed her perfect life. She blamed me entirely for the federal agents, the crushing debt, and the steel chains biting into her wrists, refusing to accept even a fraction of responsibility for her own criminal greed. I remained perfectly still in the center of the chaotic boardroom. I did not flinch, raise my voice, or offer a single word of defense against her hysterical, venomous accusations. I absorbed the sheer, unadulterated hatred radiating from her terrified face with the cold, immovable composure of a mountain facing a dying storm. Her frantic curses washed over me without leaving a single mark. I knew with absolute crystal-clear certainty that I had not destroyed their lives. I had simply stopped padding the ground beneath their reckless criminal leaps. Their own insatiable greed, their profound arrogance, and their complete disregard for the foundational laws of human decency had meticulously executed this demolition. They had built a towering monument to their own vanity, using stolen money-forged documents and ruthless manipulation. The collapse of that toxic structure was the inevitable consequence of their own fatal engineering. I looked at the chaotic scene unfolding before me. The commercial developers were hastily gathering their remaining paperwork, desperately attempting to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. The federal agents were systematically securing the room, officially seizing the fraudulent purchase agreement as primary evidence. My presence in this corporate nightmare was officially concluded. My land was legally safe, permanently protected from their predatory grasp. I turned my back on the hysterical woman and the trembling man who had tried to erase my existence. I calmly reached up and adjusted the lapels of my tailored navy jacket. I stepped smoothly away from the heavy mahogany table and walked purposefully toward the exit. I moved with the steady, grounded rhythm of a man who had successfully navigated a treacherous path and emerged completely intact. I walked past the armed agents and stepped out into the quiet, marble-lined hallway leading directly to the glass elevators. As I crossed the threshold of the executive suite, a raw, agonizing scream tore through the commotion behind me. Jordan thrashed violently against the unyielding grip of the two federal agents currently dragging him toward the restricted emergency stairwell. He twisted his neck frantically, his eyes wide and completely consumed by absolute terror. He screamed my name with a broken, guttural desperation. He begged his father to turn around, to stop the agents, to somehow fix the unfixable reality he had created. It was the exact same terrified, pleading tone he used as a child, whenever he broke something valuable, and expected me to instantly absorb the cost and mend the damage. He was desperately clinging to the deeply ingrained belief that my parental duty demanded I sacrifice my own survival to secure his. I did not break my stride. I did not pause or turn my head to witness his final descent into the federal justice system. I reached the gleaming elevator bank and firmly pressed the illuminated button for the ground floor lobby. The soft melodic chime of the arriving car sounded almost surreal against the backdrop of my son's frantic, echoing pleas. I stepped confidently into the empty mirrored cabin. I turned to face the long hallway, just as the federal agents hauled Jordan through the heavy fire doors. He screamed for me one last time, a harrowing sound of absolute ruin echoing against the polished marble walls. The heavy steel doors of the elevator began to close. I stood perfectly still, watching the narrow gap of light shrink rapidly. The thick metal panels slid shut perfectly, joining together with a quiet, definitive click. The impenetrable seal cleanly and permanently severed the sound of his voice, forever leaving me entirely alone in the quiet descent toward my reclaimed freedom. The heavy brass deadbolt of my city apartment slid back with a hollow metallic clank that mirrored the absolute echoing emptiness settling deep within my chest. I stepped over the threshold into the dark, familiar foyer, leaving the chaotic aftermath of the corporate boardroom and the wailing sirens miles behind me. The silence inside the rooms was immediate, heavy, and completely suffocating. It pressed physically against my eardrums, forcing me to confront the massive, irrevocable void I had just carved into my own life. I walked slowly into the primary bedroom to retrieve the last of my personal belongings, my leather-soled shoes striking the hardwood floor with a rhythmic, solitary finality. I was no longer a father rushing to frantically fix a disaster, nor a protector shielding his blood from the harsh, unforgiving consequences of reality. I had methodically and permanently excised my only child from my existence. The phantom echo of Jordan's desperate, frantic screams in the corporate stairwell tried to penetrate my thoughts, attempting to violently claw at the remaining fragile threads of my parental conscience. I pushed the sound away with ruthless, practiced discipline. I opened my heavy leather travel satchel on the center of the mattress and began meticulously packing the few remaining legal files and personal items I needed before departing the city forever. Every physical object I touched felt entirely detached from the life I was leaving behind. The apartment, once a proud symbol of my grueling labor and quiet success, was now nothing more than a sterile storage unit holding faded ghosts. The absolute silence of the space demanded a severe reckoning. I had successfully defended my legacy, protected the Montana sanctuary, and halted a massive federal crime, but the sheer undeniable cost of that absolute victory was total isolation. I stood in the quiet room breathing the stale, conditioned air, fully absorbing the unyielding price of true justice. I pulled open the bottom drawer of the heavy oak nightstand to gather my remaining legal ledgers and secure banking tokens. My hand brushed against a stiff, worn piece of cardstock wedged completely at the back beneath a stack of blank envelopes. I pulled the object free and held it under the soft yellow light of the bedside lamp. It was a single faded photograph of Jordan. He was exactly 6 years old, standing on a dusty municipal baseball diamond, his small hands gripping a battered wooden bat that was entirely too heavy for his slight frame. He wore a striped uniform jersey that hung loosely past his knees, and his face was split into a massive gap-toothed smile aimed directly at the camera. He had looked at me with absolute unfiltered adoration, completely trusting the man behind the lens to guide him safely through the world. My chest tightened with a sudden vicious intensity. The cold, impenetrable armor I had worn in the boardroom threatened to crack violently under the devastating weight of that single captured memory. I was instantly forced to process the agonizing dichotomy resting in my hands. The innocent, trusting boy smiling in the faded photograph was fundamentally incompatible with the sweating, desperate fraudster who had crawled on the corporate carpet and begged me to liquidate my life savings to cover a massive criminal debt. The grief rose in my throat, hot and suffocating, threatening to break my hard-fought resolve. I had to mentally reconcile the absolute death of the son I had loved with the undeniable existence of the ruthless criminal I had just delivered directly into the hands of federal agents. The boy who swung that heavy wooden bat had not survived into adulthood. He had been slowly and methodically replaced by an arrogant, entitled stranger who viewed my unconditional love as a financial weakness to be ruthlessly exploited and discarded. I stared intensely at the glossy surface of the old photograph, committing the image of the smiling child to memory. I did not give in to the surging tide of grief. I did not allow a single tear to fall, and I did not violently tear the picture into pieces. I simply let the harsh, uncompromising reality wash over me until the burning tightness in my chest subsided into a cold, permanent ache. I gently placed the photograph inside an interior zippered pocket of my leather satchel, pressing it flat against the smooth lining. I fully accepted the absolute truth of my own devastating failure. The bright, eager boy in the picture had died a very long time ago, slowly and silently suffocated by the rampant arrogance and unchecked entitlement I had foolishly allowed to flourish. I had paid for the expensive private schools, covered the deliberate mistakes, and funded the lavish safety nets, fundamentally believing my financial sacrifices equaled good parenting. I had actively watered the toxic weeds of his vanity, ultimately starving his character of any genuine accountability or moral compass. The federal handcuffs secured tightly around his wrists today were simply the final, unavoidable harvest of the seeds I had planted decades ago. I mourned the absolute loss of the 6-year-old child, but I held zero remorse for the calculating, treacherous man I had abandoned to the justice system. I zipped the leather satchel closed with a sharp, decisive motion. I secured the heavy brass buckles, effectively locking away the past. I hoisted the bag over my shoulder, the weight settling familiarly against my body. I was completely ready to leave the apartment, the city, and the toxic remnants of my former life permanently behind. I turned toward the doorway, prepared to walk out into the cold night and reclaim my isolated peace. The sharp, urgent vibration of my encrypted mobile phone shattered the heavy silence of the bedroom. I retrieved the device from my inner jacket pocket, glancing at the brightly illuminated screen. The caller ID displayed Bradley's secure, untraceable number. I answered the call immediately, expecting a routine confirmation that the federal authorities had completely processed Jordan and Heather's preliminary detention. Bradley did not offer standard legal pleasantries. His voice was clipped, carrying the rapid, tense cadence of a man actively managing a rapidly escalating crisis. He informed me directly that our digital surveillance network had just intercepted a massive spike of highly aggressive financial inquiries targeting my personal offshore accounts. The private equity loan sharks operating in the criminal underground had already received word that Jordan was heading directly to a federal penitentiary. They knew the federal government was actively freezing his entire corporate portfolio, meaning their remaining millions were completely locked out of reach. Bradley stated with freezing clarity that the violent syndicate was immediately pivoting their entire operational focus directly onto my assets. They were utilizing sophisticated illegal tracing algorithms to forcefully extract the missing capital from the father of the man who had cheated them. They were not corporate lawyers bound by boardroom etiquette. They were ruthless predators perfectly willing to deploy lethal force to recover their investments. Bradley warned me that they were actively hunting my physical location and attempting to violently breach the secure firewall protecting my primary liquid funds. The war I believed I had concluded in the glass-walled boardroom had merely mutated into a far more dangerous, entirely unregulated conflict. I tightened my grip on the leather strap of my satchel. I informed Bradley to initiate Protocol Absolute. The situation required one final devastating legal maneuver to permanently eradicate the underground threat before they could strike. The fluorescent lights of the 24-hour diner hummed with a low, erratic frequency. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from Bradley, the smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner clinging to the stale air. This was the final rendezvous point, completely insulated from the towering corporate glass and desperate financial parasites ravaging the city center. Bradley did not waste time offering comfort or ordering a meal. He immediately retrieved a heavy stack of dense, tightly bound financial injunctions from his leather briefcase and spread them across the sticky Formica table. The private equity loan sharks Jordan had foolishly entangled himself with were not conventional banking institutions, restricted by standard operational boundaries. They were ruthless, highly sophisticated syndicates that specialized in extracting capital by any means necessary. Bradley laid out the stark, uncompromising reality of the incoming digital assault. These syndicates were currently deploying aggressive asset tracing algorithms, desperately searching for any residual familial link connecting Jordan's massive criminal deficit directly to my personal offshore accounts. We had successfully halted the fraudulent land acquisition, but the bloodhounds were now tracking the scent of my legitimate, untainted wealth. I needed an absolute impenetrable legal firewall to protect my remaining resources. Bradley slid a thick black pen across the table, tapping his finger on the first signature line. The documents waiting for my authorization were designed to legally obliterate any remaining financial connection between my identity and my former son. This was not a simple alteration of a standard will or a temporary shifting of banking assets. It was a complete and utter financial severance, a legally binding excision that would make it a federal crime for Jordan's predatory creditors to look in my direction. I stared at the dense paragraphs of legal armor preparing to execute the final defensive maneuver. Bradley leaned forward, his voice barely rising above the clatter of silverware from the kitchen. He meticulously detailed the syndicate's likely strategy, explaining exactly how their aggressive legal proxies would attempt to pierce the corporate veil of the irrevocable blind trust. They would argue that the sudden transfer of the 500-acre estate was a deliberate fraudulent conveyance orchestrated specifically to shield assets from legitimate debt collection. If they successfully broke through the legal shielding, they would instantly seize the Montana ranch, liquidate the valuable timber, and bulldoze the pristine valley to construct the exact corporate resort Jordan had originally envisioned. The mere thought of those heavy machines tearing into the soil triggered a visceral protective rage deep within my chest. I looked out the diner window into the dark, rain-slicked parking lot and remembered Valerie. In her final days, the heavy hospital air had been thick with the scent of antiseptic, but she had only spoken of the crisp mountain wind blowing through the pines. Her dying wish was never about securing a massive financial legacy or passing down a lucrative real estate portfolio to our arrogant son. She had squeezed my hand with the last of her fading strength, asking me to ensure the land remained wild, completely untouched by the ravenous machinery of corporate greed. She had seen the destructive ambition taking root in Jordan long before I was willing to admit it to myself. I had spent the last decade blindly attempting to bridge the massive gap between Valerie's sacred wish and Jordan's relentless entitlement. I realized now that those two opposing forces could never coexist peacefully. Protecting Valerie's memory required the absolute destruction of Jordan's inheritance. I looked back at the legal documents resting on the Formica table. I did not feel the crushing weight of parental guilt. I felt the profound clarity of a man fulfilling a sacred vow. By executing these injunctions, I was permanently and irrevocably disinheriting my only child, completely stripping him of any future claim to the estate, the liquid capital, or the legacy we had built. I picked up the thick black pen. I did not hesitate or allow my hand to waver. I firmly pressed the ink to the paper and signed my name across the heavy legal injunctions with a remarkably steady hand. I executed every required signature, initialing every complex addendum Bradley had meticulously drafted. The sheer volume of the paperwork represented a fortress of uncompromising legal authority. By signing these specific documents, I fundamentally altered the core structure of the blind trust. I permanently bound the 500 acres of Montana wilderness to an established, heavily guarded charitable foundation. The land was no longer just a protected wildlife reserve. It was legally converted into an educational sanctuary specifically mandated for underprivileged city youth. The trust was now structured to utilize the existing liquid capital to fund fully immersive outdoor programs, allowing children from concrete environments to experience the vast, healing expanse of nature Valerie had cherished. The corporate structure of the charity was completely ironclad, overseen by a massive federal oversight board that actively hunted and prosecuted financial interference. Jordan's predatory creditors could deploy their most aggressive legal proxies and utilize their most sophisticated tracing algorithms, but they would find absolutely nothing to attach a lien against. They could not touch a single blade of grass, harvest a single tree, or extract a single cent from the foundation. The property was entirely insulated by federal charity laws, rendering the estate completely untouchable by private debt collectors. I pushed the signed stack of documents back across the table toward Bradley. The legal conversion was absolute and irreversible. The wealth I had generated over a lifetime of grueling labor would no longer serve as a toxic safety net for arrogance and entitlement. It would serve as a permanent, living monument to genuine growth and untouched natural beauty. Bradley gathered the freshly executed documents, carefully organizing them into perfectly aligned stacks before sliding them securely into his leather briefcase. He snapped the heavy brass locks shut, finalizing the impenetrable legal barrier. He looked at me with deep professional respect. He extended his right hand across the diner table, confirming the fortress was officially secure, and the private equity predators had been permanently locked out. I firmly gripped his hand, feeling the solid grounding reality of a mission completely fulfilled. I slid out of the vinyl booth and picked up my single canvas suitcase. I did not look back at the table or linger in the stale atmosphere of the diner. I stepped out into the damp, freezing night air, the heavy rumble of jet engines vibrating through the cracked pavement of the parking lot. I walked steadily toward the brightly illuminated entrance of the main airport terminal. The automatic sliding glass doors parted smoothly, welcoming me into the sterile, echoing expanse of the departure concourse. I bypassed the crowded ticketing counters and moved directly toward the security checkpoints, carrying only what I needed to survive the harsh Montana winters. I was officially leaving the suffocating concrete grid of the city, leaving behind the chaotic remnants of a shattered corporate conspiracy, and permanently leaving behind the treacherous illusion of the son I once knew. The heavy emotional anchor that had chained me to this toxic environment was completely severed. I walked toward the departure gate, ready to board the red-eye flight back to the high country. I stepped onto the aircraft carrying the absolute peace of a man who had successfully defended his territory and finally secured his true freedom. The heavy reinforced tires of the 4x4 truck crunched rhythmically against the loose gravel of the long, winding driveway. The imposing steel security gates of the property closed securely behind the vehicle, finalizing the physical and emotional separation from the toxic world I had permanently left behind. I shifted the transmission into park and cut the powerful engine. The sudden, profound silence of the Montana wilderness flooded the cabin of the truck, completely replacing the chaotic, suffocating sirens of the distant city. I pushed open the heavy door and stepped out into the crisp, high-altitude air. The sprawling, 500-acre estate stretched out majestically before me, completely enveloped under a massive, unblemished blue sky. The sheer scale of the landscape was both breathtaking and deeply intimidating. For exactly 70 years, my entire existence had been rigorously defined by relentless, unyielding service to others. I had been a devoted husband, carrying the heavy weight of a household, a tireless laborer pouring freezing concrete to build a secure financial future, and a blindly loyal father endlessly repairing the self-inflicted disasters of a deeply flawed son. Every single decision I had ever made was meticulously calculated to protect, provide for, and sustain the people who depended entirely on my strength. Now standing completely alone on the packed dirt of the driveway, the crushing burden of constant provision had been totally eradicated. The absolute freedom was a shocking, entirely unfamiliar physical sensation that bordered on vertigo. I was a man who had spent a lifetime holding up the collapsing walls of a deeply fractured family structure. Dropping that massive weight forced me to confront a terrifying, entirely new reality. I possessed absolutely no blueprint for living a life dedicated exclusively to my own peace and preservation. I grabbed the handle of my single canvas suitcase from the passenger seat and closed the door. The task ahead was no longer about defending a financial legacy or outmaneuvering ruthless corporate predators in a glass boardroom. The true daunting challenge was learning exactly how to breathe, exist, and build a completely singular identity in the vast, unbroken quiet of my newly reclaimed territory. I carried the worn canvas suitcase up the wide wooden steps of the main log cabin. My heavy work boots struck the solid timber planks with a steady, grounding cadence that echoed across the empty yard. I walked across the sprawling wraparound porch and stopped precisely at the polished wooden railing. I leaned my weight heavily against the sturdy timber, letting my eyes trace the sweeping, dramatic contours of the sprawling valley below. The biting mountain wind swept forcefully down from the jagged peaks, carrying the sharp, clean scent of ancient pine needles and rich, dark earth. Down in the lush emerald green of the lower pasture, a dedicated team of seasoned ranch hands skillfully guided a herd of wild horses toward the northern grazing fields. The rhythmic thundering of their heavy hooves against the soil echoed perfectly through the quiet morning air. This was precisely the vibrant, untamed sanctuary Valerie had fiercely envisioned in her final days on Earth. She had grown deeply exhausted by the suffocating concrete of the city and the shallow, toxic ambition that was rapidly consuming our sun. As I watched the magnificent animals run completely free across the protected land, the familiar, comforting warmth of my late wife seemed to materialize right beside me in the freezing mountain air. I did not need to speak aloud to feel her absolute, unwavering presence. She stood silently at my shoulder, looking out over the pristine landscape she had fought so desperately to preserve. I could feel her profound, spiritual validation of the brutal, uncompromising choices I had made in the city. I had utterly refused to allow her sacred legacy to be bulldozed into a sterile corporate resort to cover Jordan's massive criminal debts. I had successfully built an impenetrable legal fortress around the soil we had originally purchased together. The heavy sorrow of my recent familial severance was gently tempered by the sheer beauty of the living, breathing monument I had successfully protected. The ghost of the woman I loved nodded in silent, absolute approval of my unrelenting strength. I turned away from the wooden railing and walked slowly into the quiet, welcoming warmth of the log cabin. I moved methodically into the rustic kitchen, filling the metal percolator with fresh, cold well water and dark, coarse coffee grounds. The familiar rhythmic bubbling of the brewing coffee provided a comforting, predictable anchor in the absolute stillness of the large house. I poured the steaming, pitch-black liquid into a heavy ceramic mug, the intense heat radiating immediately through the thick walls of the cup and into my calloused hands. I walked back out onto the expansive wooden porch and lowered myself into the worn, high-backed rocking chair facing the eastern mountain ridge. The wooden runners groaned softly against the deck boards as I settled into the seat. I sat in complete silence, taking a slow, measured sip of the bitter coffee. I waited patiently for the dark, corrosive thrill of vindictive triumph to wash over me. I waited to feel a vicious, ugly satisfaction regarding Jordan's inevitable federal imprisonment or Heather's absolute social and financial destruction. The feeling never arrived. I did not experience a single drop of hollow, malicious joy. Instead, a profound, deeply grounding peace settled permanently into my bones. The frantic, chaotic noise of the city, the endless corporate manipulations, and the toxic cycle of parental guilt were entirely eradicated from my mind. What I had executed in that boardroom was not an act of fiery emotional revenge. It was the precise surgical execution of a necessary adjustment. I had simply drawn a hard, immovable line in the sand and firmly defended my fundamental dignity against those who ruthlessly sought to strip it away. I had restored the natural balance of consequences, allowing the heavy hammer of reality to fall squarely and fairly on the architects of their own disaster. The vibrant, piercing light of the morning sun finally broke violently over the jagged crest of the eastern mountain ridge. The brilliant golden rays sliced perfectly through the freezing mountain mist, instantly illuminating the vast, untamed expanse of the protected wilderness. The deep shadows retreating rapidly from the timberline mirrored the heavy, suffocating darkness, finally lifting from my own weary soul. I set the warm ceramic mug down on the small wooden table beside the rocking chair. I closed my eyes and took a massive, unfiltered breath of the pristine, high-altitude air, filling my lungs completely with the absolute essence of my hard-won victory. The crushing weight of the past 70 years dissolved entirely into the sweeping Montana breeze. I opened my eyes and stared out at the sprawling sanctuary resting safely under the impenetrable protection of the Federal Charitable Trust. I fully recognized that the road stretching out ahead of me would be undeniably quiet. There would be no more sudden phone calls demanding immediate financial rescue, no more fabricated emergencies, and no more toxic family gatherings engineered entirely to extract my hard-earned wealth. The path stretching out before me was completely devoid of that exhausting cyclical manipulation. The profound silence of the valley was not an oppressive, lonely void, but a massive, brilliant blank canvas. The natural order of my universe was completely and unconditionally restored. Every upcoming sunrise, every quiet evening spent on this wooden porch, and every single decision I made from this exact moment forward belonged entirely and exclusively to me. I leaned back into the comfortable embrace of the rocking chair, deeply rooted in the very soil I had so fiercely defended. My life finally and unequivocally was completely my own. The heavy tires of the rented truck crunched against the familiar gravel of the winding driveway, signaling my final return to the sanctuary I had fought so fiercely to protect. I shifted the vehicle into park and cut the engine, allowing the profound, absolute silence of the Montana wilderness to wash over me. The sprawling 500 acres of untamed land stretched out majestically beneath a massive, unblemished blue sky. I stepped out of the cab feeling the crisp, high-altitude air fill my lungs. The sheer scale of the landscape was breathtaking, yet it carried a deeply intimidating weight. For 70 years, my entire existence had been rigorously defined by relentless, unyielding service to others. I had been the tireless provider, the silent architect of a family's financial security, and the reliable safety net for a son who ultimately viewed my sacrifices with utter contempt. Every decision, every grueling hour of labor had been dedicated to shielding my dependents from the harsh realities of the world. Now, standing alone on the packed dirt of the driveway, that massive burden of constant provision had been permanently eradicated. The sudden absolute freedom felt staggering. I had spent a lifetime holding up the collapsing walls of a fractured family structure, entirely neglecting my own needs in the process. Releasing that crushing weight forced me to confront a terrifying new reality. I possessed absolutely no blueprint for living a life dedicated exclusively to my own peace and preservation. The true daunting challenge awaiting me was not defending a legacy or fighting corporate predators. The real challenge was learning exactly how to breathe, exist, and build a completely singular identity in the vast, unbroken quiet of my reclaimed territory. I carried my single canvas suitcase up the wide wooden steps of the main log cabin. My heavy boots struck the solid timber planks with a steady grounding cadence that echoed across the empty yard. I walked across the sprawling wraparound porch and stopped precisely at the polished wooden railing. Leaning my weight heavily against the sturdy timber, I let my eyes trace the sweeping, dramatic contours of the sprawling valley below. The biting mountain wind swept forcefully down from the jagged peaks, carrying the sharp, clean scent of ancient pine needles and rich, dark earth. Down in the lush emerald green of the lower pasture, a dedicated team of seasoned ranch hands skillfully guided a herd of wild horses toward the northern grazing fields. The rhythmic thundering of their heavy hooves against the soil echoed perfectly through the quiet morning air. This vibrant, untamed sanctuary was exactly what Valerie had fiercely envisioned in her final days. She had grown deeply exhausted by the suffocating concrete of the city and the shallow, toxic ambition that was rapidly consuming our son. In her last moments, she had squeezed my hand, begging me to ensure this land remained wild and completely untouched by the ravenous machinery of corporate greed. She had seen the destructive entitlement taking root in Jordan long before I was willing to admit it to myself. I had spent the last decade blindly attempting to bridge the massive gap between Valerie's sacred wish and Jordan's relentless greed. As I watched the magnificent animals run completely free across the protected land, the familiar comforting warmth of my late wife seemed to materialize right beside me in the freezing mountain air. I did not need to speak aloud to feel her unwavering presence. She stood silently at my shoulder, looking out over the pristine landscape she had fought so desperately to preserve. I could feel her profound spiritual validation of the brutal, uncompromising choices I had made in the city. The ghost of the woman I loved nodded in silent, absolute approval of my unrelenting strength. I had turned away from this wooden railing and walked slowly into the quiet, welcoming warmth of the log cabin. I moved methodically into the rustic kitchen, filling the metal percolator with fresh well water and coarse coffee grounds. The familiar, rhythmic bubbling of the brewing coffee provided a comforting, predictable anchor in the absolute stillness of the large house. I poured the steaming, pitch-black liquid into a heavy ceramic mug, the intense heat radiating immediately through the thick walls of the cup and into my calloused hands. I walked back out onto the expansive wooden porch and lowered myself into the worn, high-backed rocking chair facing the eastern mountain ridge. The wooden runners groaned softly against the deck boards as I settled into the seat. I sat in complete silence, taking a slow, measured sip of the bitter coffee. I waited patiently for the dark, corrosive thrill of vindictive triumph to wash over me. I waited to feel a vicious, ugly satisfaction regarding Jordan's inevitable federal imprisonment and the total collapse of his fraudulent empire. The feeling never arrived. I did not experience a single drop of hollow, malicious joy. Instead, a profound, deeply grounding peace settled permanently into my bones. The frantic, chaotic noise of the city, the endless corporate manipulations, and the toxic cycle of parental guilt were entirely eradicated from my mind. What I had executed was not an act of fiery emotional revenge. It was the precise surgical execution of a necessary adjustment. I had simply drawn a hard, immovable line in the sand and firmly defended my fundamental dignity against those who ruthlessly sought to strip it away. I had restored the natural balance of consequences, allowing the heavy hammer of reality to fall fairly. The vibrant, piercing light of the morning sun finally broke violently over the jagged crest of the eastern mountain ridge. The brilliant golden rays sliced perfectly through the freezing mountain mist, instantly illuminating the vast, untamed expanse of the protected wilderness. The deep shadows retreating rapidly from the timberline mirrored the heavy, suffocating darkness, finally lifting from my own weary soul. I set the warm ceramic mug down on the small wooden table beside the rocking chair. I closed my eyes and took a massive, unfiltered breath of the pristine, high-altitude air, filling my lungs completely with the absolute essence of my hard-won victory. The crushing weight of the past 70 years dissolved entirely into the sweeping Montana breeze. I opened my eyes and stared out at the sprawling sanctuary, resting safely under the impenetrable protection of the Federal Charitable Trust. I fully recognized that the road stretching out ahead of me would be undeniably quiet. There would be no more sudden phone calls demanding immediate financial rescue, no more fabricated emergencies, and no more toxic family gatherings engineered entirely to extract my hard-earned wealth. The path stretching out before me was completely devoid of that exhausting, cyclical manipulation. The profound silence of the valley was not an oppressive, lonely void, but a massive, brilliant, blank canvas. The natural order of my universe was completely and unconditionally restored. Every upcoming sunrise, every quiet evening spent on this wooden porch, and every single decision I made from this exact moment forward belonged entirely and exclusively to me. I leaned back into the comfortable embrace of the rocking chair, deeply rooted in the very soil I had so fiercely defended. My life finally and unequivocally was completely my own. True love does not mean shielding someone from the consequences of their own actions. When we constantly rescue those who exploit our generosity, we do not teach them gratitude. Instead, we only teach them entitlement. Real strength requires establishing unbreakable boundaries and fiercely protecting your own dignity. You cannot buy genuine respect, and you cannot fix a broken moral compass with endless financial sacrifices. Sometimes the most profound act of love you can offer yourself is to walk away entirely. Leaving toxic relationships is never a selfish failure. It is the ultimate realization of your own value and permanent peace. If you found value in this story of reclaiming dignity and establishing firm boundaries, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below. How would you have handled this situation? Let's keep the conversation going.